The schoolmarm's secret, the children's screams cut through the October morning air like knife blades as flames engulfed the Red Creek schoolhouse. Miss Katherine Hartwell stood frozen on the school steps, watching smoke pour from windows, where her students should have been reciting their multiplication tables. But the fire wasn't what made her blood turn to ice. It was the sight of her classroom door, chained shut from the outside with a heavy padlock. Someone had deliberately trapped 23 children inside a burning building, and Katherine knew exactly who had done it, because she recognized the distinctive lock her stepfather used to secure his most valuable possessions. The same stepfather who discovered her real identity 3 days earlier, the same man who'd threatened to expose her unless she abandoned her teaching position and returned to the life she'd fled 5 years ago. But what Samuel Morrison didn't know was that Katherine Hartwell wasn't really a schoolteacher at all. She was Rachel Morrison, his stepdaughter, and she'd spent those 5 years learning skills that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with killing men who hurt children. The fire was meant to eliminate both her secret identity and the witnesses who might remember seeing a woman they knew as Miss Hartwell in places where Rachel Morrison was supposed to be. Instead, it had just signed Samuel Morrison's death warrant, because Rachel Morrison had come to Red Creek not to teach school, but to hunt the man who'd spent years selling children to buyers who valued young workers more than young lives. The teaching position was perfect cover for someone gathering evidence about missing children and the adults who'd facilitated their disappearances. But to understand why a former victim had become a predator's worst nightmare, we need to go back to when 12-year-old Rachel Morrison first learned that some adults viewed children as merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. Back to the night she discovered her stepfather's true profession and made the choice that would define the rest of her life. Kansas City, Missouri, 1878. 12-year-old Rachel Morrison pressed her ear against the keyhole of her stepfather's study, listening to a conversation that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family. Through the thin, wooden door, she could hear Samuel Morrison's voice mixing with that of a stranger, a man whose cultured accent couldn't disguise the coldness underneath his polite words. The Denver buyers are particularly interested in children between 8 and 14, the stranger was saying. Old enough to work, young enough to be trainable. They're willing to pay premium prices for healthy specimens with basic education. Rachel felt confusion washing over her as she tried to understand what they were discussing. Buyers, specimens? What did any of that have to do with her stepfather's freight business? I can provide 12 children next month, Samuel replied. 8 boys, 4 girls, all from families that won't be missed. Orphans, mostly, or children whose parents have experienced unfortunate accidents. The stranger's voice carried satisfaction. Excellent. My clients in Colorado Territory are expanding their mining operations and need workers who can fit into tight spaces. Children are ideal for that kind of work. Rachel's blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over her like a physical blow. Her stepfather wasn't running a legitimate freight business. He was selling children to people who used them as slave labor in dangerous mines. The trips he took every month, the mysterious shipments that left Kansas City in the dead of night, the way he always seemed to have more money than his declared income could explain, it all made horrible sense now. What about security? Samuel asked. The territorial authorities have been asking questions about missing children. Handled. We have arrangements with local sheriffs and territorial officials, as long as we're discreet and avoid taking children. From prominent families, there won't be any serious investigations. Rachel crept closer to the door, trying to hear every word of a conversation that was reshaping her understanding of the world. Her stepfather, the man who'd married her widowed mother and promised to care for them both, was a monster who stole children and sold them into slavery. The Chicago route is becoming problematic, Samuel continued. Too many people asking questions about children who've disappeared near railway stations. I'm thinking of shifting operations south, maybe working through St. Louis. Whatever you think best. My clients care about results, not methods. Rachel heard chairs scraping against wood as the men stood to conclude their business. She scrambled away from the door and ran toward the stairs, but she wasn't quick enough. Samuel Morrison emerged from his study just as she reached the hallway, and his eyes narrowed as he saw her guilty expression. "Rachel, what are you doing up so late?" I couldn't sleep. I was getting a glass of water from the kitchen." Samuel studied her face with the calculating attention of someone who'd spent years reading people's intentions and motivations. Rachel tried to project innocence, but she could see suspicion growing in his expression. "Did you hear anything interesting while you were getting your water?" "No, sir. Just voices talking about business." Samuel stepped closer, and Rachel could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. The man who'd always been cold and distant toward her now seemed actively menacing. "Rachel, I want you to understand something very clearly. Sometimes adults discuss business matters that children aren't supposed to hear. If a child repeats those conversations to people outside the family, very bad things can happen to everyone involved." "I understand, sir. Do you?" "Because some children are too curious for their own good, and curious children sometimes end up in situations where they can't cause problems for the adults who care for them." Rachel understood the threat. If Samuel suspected she'd overheard his conversation about selling children, she might become one of those children who disappeared without a trace. "I didn't hear anything, Mr. Morrison. I was just getting water." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. Because I'd hate to think that my stepdaughter was the kind of child who couldn't be trusted with family business." Rachel climbed the stairs to her bedroom on shaking legs, understanding that her life had just changed forever. She couldn't tell her mother what she'd learned. Mother was so grateful to Samuel for marrying her and providing financial security that she would never believe her new husband was a criminal. She couldn't tell local authorities because Samuel had connections with law enforcement that would ensure any accusations against him were dismissed or ignored. And she couldn't run away because 12-year-old girls who disappeared from respectable homes became exactly the kind of merchandise Samuel Morrison traded in. Rachel lay awake that night, staring at her bedroom ceiling and trying to understand how the world could contain adults who viewed children as objects to be bought and sold. She'd always known there were bad people in the world, but she'd never imagined that evil could be so organized, so casual, so completely protected by corruption. But she also made a promise to herself that night, a promise that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. Someday, when she was old enough and strong enough and smart enough, she was going to make Samuel Morrison pay for every child he'd sold into slavery. She was going to destroy his operation, expose his crimes, and ensure that he spent the rest of his life paying for what he'd done to innocent children. It was a promise that would require years of patience, careful planning, and skills she didn't yet possess. But Rachel Morrison was going to keep that promise, if it was the last thing she ever did. The opportunity to begin planning her revenge came sooner than expected. 3 days after overhearing Samuel's conversation, Rachel's mother became ill, with what the doctor diagnosed as pneumonia. She died within a week, leaving Rachel alone with the stepfather who traded in children's lives. Samuel Morrison now had legal custody of a 12-year-old girl who knew too much about his criminal activities. Rachel expected him to ship her off to one of his buyers immediately, but instead he made a different choice. He decided to keep her as household help, reasoning that a stepdaughter who lived in his house was easier to control than one who might escape from distant buyers and return to cause problems. Rachel would cook, clean, and maintain his home while he continued his trafficking operations. But Samuel made a crucial mistake. He underestimated how much a 12-year-old girl could learn when she was motivated by hatred and had constant access to his business records. Over the following months, Rachel discovered that Samuel's operation was much larger than she'd initially realized. He wasn't just selling children to mining companies in Colorado Territory. He was supplying buyers throughout the American West, with young workers for factories, farms, brothels, and private households. He had contacts in orphanages who provided him with children whose disappearances wouldn't be investigated. He worked with corrupt officials who falsified death certificates for children who were actually being shipped to buyers. He even arranged accidents for parents whose children he wanted to acquire, creating orphans who could be taken without legal complications. Rachel documented everything she could find, copying names and addresses from Samuel's correspondence, memorizing shipping schedules and payment arrangements, building a detailed picture of a criminal network that spanned half the continent. But she also did something else during those months of forced servitude. She began preparing herself for the war she planned to wage against Samuel Morrison and everyone who worked with him. She learned to pick locks by practicing on Samuel's desk drawers and file cabinets. She taught herself to forge signatures by copying Samuel's handwriting until she could reproduce it perfectly. She studied maps and railroad schedules, learning the routes Samuel used to transport his victims. Most importantly, she learned to make herself invisible. Samuel had ordered her to stay in the house during his business meetings, but Rachel discovered ways to eavesdrop on conversations without being detected. She learned the names of Samuel's associates, their methods of operation, their strengths and weaknesses. By her 13th birthday, Rachel Morrison had transformed from a grieving child into a focused intelligence gatherer who knew more about Samuel's trafficking network than some of his own associates. But she also knew she couldn't act on that knowledge yet. 13-year-old girls didn't have the resources or credibility to bring down criminal organizations. She needed to be older, smarter, and more capable before she could begin the work of destroying Samuel Morrison. So she waited and planned and learned everything she could about the man who'd murdered her mother and sold dozens of children into slavery. The chance to escape came when Rachel turned 16. Samuel had grown comfortable with her presence in his household no longer, viewing her as a potential threat but as a useful servant who maintained his domestic arrangements while he focused on his criminal enterprises. That comfort made him careless. One evening in February 1882, Samuel left for a business trip to Denver without securing his study properly. Rachel seized the opportunity to copy every document in his files, creating a complete record of his criminal activities over the previous 4 years. She also stole enough money from his personal safe to fund her disappearance, reasoning that money earned from selling children could be ethically used to rescue children. By dawn, Rachel Morrison had vanished from Kansas City without a trace, leaving behind only a note informing Samuel that his stepdaughter had died in a railway accident while visiting relatives in St. Louis. She'd forged the death certificate herself and arranged for it to be filed with territorial authorities, creating a legal record of her own demise. As far as the world was concerned, Rachel Morrison was dead. In her place stood Katherine Hartwell, a young woman from Boston who'd come west to pursue a career in education after losing her family to scarlet fever. Katherine Hartwell had impeccable credentials, glowing references from Eastern schools, and a passion for teaching that impressed everyone who met her. She was also completely fictional, created through careful forgery and strategic correspondence with people who'd never existed. But most importantly, Katherine Hartwell had a mission. She was going to use her teaching positions to investigate missing children, document crimes against minors, and gather evidence that could be used to destroy the criminal network that had murdered her mother and enslaved dozens of innocent children. The work took years. Katherine Hartwell taught in mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad settlements throughout Colorado Territory, always seeking communities where children had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. She documented patterns of disappearance, identified corrupt officials who facilitated trafficking operations, and slowly built cases that could eventually be prosecuted. But she also did something else during those years of investigation. She learned skills that would allow her to take direct action against criminals who were too well protected for conventional justice. She learned to shoot with deadly accuracy. She studied chemistry and anatomy, learning about poisons and pressure points that could incapacitate or kill. She practiced moving silently through darkness, picking locks, and disabling security measures. Katherine Hartwell was a dedicated schoolteacher who genuinely cared about her students' education and welfare. But she was also Rachel Morrison, a woman who'd spent years preparing to wage war against people who hurt children. By 1887, she'd tracked Samuel Morrison's operations to the town of Red Creek, Colorado Territory, where she discovered he'd established a new base of operations. Children had been disappearing from settlements throughout the region, always orphans or children from poor families whose absences wouldn't trigger serious investigations. Katherine Hartwell applied for the teaching position at Red Creek's one-room schoolhouse, presenting credentials that made her the obvious choice for the job. She established herself in the community as a devoted educator who worked tirelessly to improve her students' prospects. But she was also gathering evidence about Samuel Morrison's trafficking network, documenting his methods and preparing to expose his crimes to federal authorities who couldn't be bought with trafficking profits. The plan had been working perfectly until 3 days ago when Samuel Morrison arrived in Red Creakin recognized his supposedly dead stepdaughter behind the facade of Miss Katherine Hartwell. Now, watching the schoolhouse burn with her students trapped inside, Rachel Morrison understood that the time for patient investigation was over. Samuel had declared war by attempting to murder 23 children just to silence one witness. Rachel Morrison was about to show him exactly what kind of enemy he'd created when he'd taught a 12-year-old girl that some adults were monsters who needed to be destroyed. The fire wouldn't be the end of Samuel Morrison's crimes. It would be the beginning of his reckoning with the child he'd thought was too weak to threaten him. But first, she had to save the children he'd tried to murder. Rachel didn't waste time with the padlocked door. She'd learned that burning buildings killed people through smoke and heat, not just flames, and her students needed fresh air immediately. She ran to the side of the schoolhouse where she'd noticed loose boards during her inspection of the building's condition 2 weeks earlier. Using her boot heel as a hammer, she kicked through the weathered planks until she'd created an opening large enough for children to crawl through. Smoke poured out of the gap, along with the terrified voices of her students. Miss Hartwell. Tommy Chun's voice carried clearly despite the chaos inside. The door won't open. I know, Tommy. I'm making another way out. Rachel shouted back. Everyone stay low and crawl toward my voice. One by one, her students emerged from the burning building, coughing and crying, but alive. Rachel counted heads frantically. 20, 21, 22. One missing. Where's Emma? She called to the children gathered around her. She fell down when the smoke got thick, said Mary Sullivan, a 10-year-old whose parents ran the town's general store. She's still inside. Rachel didn't hesitate. She crawled through the hole in the wall and into the smoke-filled schoolhouse, following the sound of Emma's coughing to where the 8-year-old lay unconscious near the back of the room. The heat was intense, and smoke made it nearly impossible to see or breathe. But Rachel had prepared for situations like this during her years of planning for war against Samuel Morrison. She wrapped Emma in her shawl and dragged her toward the opening, using the wall as a guide through the choking darkness. They emerged from the burning building just as the roof began to collapse. Rachel carried Emma to where the other children waited, checking her pulse and breathing while her mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. Samuel Morrison had tried to commit mass murder to protect his secret. That meant he was desperate enough to take enormous risks, which suggested he was planning something that would make exposure catastrophic for his operations. But it also meant he'd shown his hand. He was no longer hiding behind legitimate business fronts or using subtle methods to eliminate threats. He was willing to kill 23 children and one schoolteacher in broad daylight, which meant he thought himself untouchable by local law enforcement. Rachel was about to prove him wrong. Tommy, she said to the oldest of her students, I need you to take the other children to Dr. Peterson's house. Tell him there was an accident at the school and Emma needs medical attention. What about? You, Miss Hartwell? Rachel looked at the burning schoolhouse, then at the trail of boot prints leading away from the building toward the hills outside town. Samuel Morrison was probably watching from a distance, making sure his plan had succeeded. I'm going to find out who did this to you, she said grimly, and I'm going to make sure they never hurt children again. As her students headed toward town, Rachel followed the boot prints into the hills, her mind shifting from the protective instincts of Katherine Hartwell to the predatory focus of Rachel Morrison. Samuel Morrison had made his last mistake. He'd threatened children under Rachel's protection, and now he was going to discover what happened to people who tried to murder school children to cover up their own crimes. The hunt had begun. Rachel tracked Samuel's boot prints through the rocky hills above Red Creek, following a trail that led to an abandoned mining claim about 2 miles from town. The tracks were fresh and clear in the soft earth between stones, and she could see where Samuel had stopped several times to look back toward the burning schoolhouse. As she climbed higher into the hills, Rachel began to see the logic of Samuel's choice of hiding place. The abandoned mine provided clear views of Red Creek and the surrounding valley, making it impossible for anyone to approach without being seen. It also offered multiple escape routes through the maze of old mining tunnels that honeycombed the mountainside. But Samuel Morrison had made a crucial error in choosing this location. Rachel had spent 5 years investigating missing children in mining communities, and she knew more about abandoned mines than most people who'd actually worked in them. She understood the tunnel systems, the ventilation patterns, and most importantly, the ways to trap people inside mines who thought they were safe. As she approached the mine entrance, Rachel could see smoke from a small campfire deep inside the main tunnel. Samuel was waiting there, probably expecting to hear news about the success of his attack on the schoolhouse. Instead, he was about to receive a visit from the stepdaughter he'd tried to kill 15 years earlier. Rachel circled the mine entrance, looking for alternate access points that would allow her to approach Samuel without being detected. She found what she was looking for in a ventilation shaft that connected to the main tunnel about 50 yards from the entrance. The shaft was narrow and dark, but Rachel had spent years practicing movement through confined spaces. She lowered herself into the opening and began crawling through the tunnel toward the sound of Samuel's voice. He was talking to someone, another man whose voice Rachel didn't recognize. As she got closer, she could hear their conversation clearly through the thin rock walls. "The schoolhouse is completely destroyed," Samuel was saying, "along with the teacher and all the children who might have seen too much. You're sure the Morrison girl is dead this time?" the other man asked. "She was inside the building when I chained the door shut. Nobody could survive that fire." Rachel felt cold satisfaction at hearing Samuel's premature celebration. He thought he'd eliminated the last threat to his criminal operations, but instead he just revealed the location of his current base and confirmed his guilt in attempted mass murder. "What about the buyers in Denver?" the other man continued. "They're expecting their shipment next week. The shipment will be delivered as promised. I've already identified 12 children from settlements along the railway line, orphans and runaways who won't be missed." Rachel reached a point in the ventilation shaft where she could see into the main tunnel. Samuel Morrison sat beside a small fire, looking older and harder than she remembered from her childhood. Across from him was a younger man, inexpensive. Clothes, probably one of Samuel's buyers or associates. Both men were armed, but they'd made the mistake of feeling secure in their hidden location. Neither was watching for threats from the ventilation system above their heads. Rachel had several options for dealing with the situation. She could retreat and bring federal marshals to arrest Samuel and his associate. She could wait for them to leave and search their campsite for evidence of their criminal activities. Or she could end Samuel Morrison's career permanently, right here and right now. She chose the third option. Rachel had brought tools for exactly this kind of situation. From her position in the ventilation shaft, she could reach the wooden supports that held up the tunnel ceiling. A few strategic cuts with her knife would cause a controlled collapse that would trap both men underground without necessarily killing them immediately. But as she positioned herself to begin working, Samuel said something that changed her plans entirely. The children from the Morrison settlement in Kansas should arrive tomorrow morning. 12 young ones, all healthy and properly documented as orphans who died in a typhoid outbreak. Rachel's blood turned to ice. Samuel wasn't just continuing his trafficking operations, he was expanding them. 12 more children were about to be sold into slavery, and their disappearance would be covered up by forged death certificates. She couldn't wait for federal marshals or territorial authorities to investigate Samuel's crimes. Those 12 children would be shipped to buyers and disappear forever while authorities debated jurisdiction and evidence. Rachel Morrison was the only person who could save them, and she had to act immediately. She positioned her knife against the main support beam and began cutting through the wood with quick, precise strokes. The beam was already weakened by years of moisture and neglect, and it took only minutes to weaken it to the point of failure. The tunnel collapse was sudden and dramatic. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down from the ceiling, trapping Samuel and his associate under debris while clouds of dust filled the air. Rachel waited in the ventilation shaft until the dust settled, then called down to the buried men. "Samuel Morrison, this is your stepdaughter Rachel, the one you thought you killed in the schoolhouse fire." Silence from below, then Samuel's voice muffled by rock and dirt. "Rachel? But you're dead. I saw the death certificate." "I forged the death certificate, Samuel, just like you've been forging documents for dead children who are actually being sold to your buyers." Rachel's voice carried clearly through the collapsed tunnel. "I've spent 5 years documenting your crimes and learning exactly how to destroy your organization. You can't prove anything, and even if you could, you'll never make it out of these mountains alive." Rachel laughed, and the sound echoed eerily through the mine shafts. "Samuel, I'm not trying to prove anything in court. I'm here to stop you from selling 12 more children tomorrow morning, and to make sure you never hurt another child again." "What do you want?" "I want you to tell me everything about tomorrow's shipment, where the children are being held, how they're being transported, who the buyers are. If you cooperate, I might let you live long enough to face federal prosecution." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating his options. He was trapped underground with limited air and no way to escape without Rachel's help. But he was also a man who'd spent decades surviving dangerous situations through cunning and ruthlessness. "And if I don't cooperate?" "Then you die here, buried under tons of rock, while I rescue those 12 children and destroy your entire network using the evidence I've been gathering for 5 years. You're bluffing." "You don't have evidence." Rachel reached into her coat and withdrew a folder of documents she'd been carrying. She dropped it through the ventilation shaft so it landed near Samuel's position in the collapsed tunnel. "Those are copies of correspondence between you and buyers in 7 territories. Names, dates, prices, shipping methods. Everything federal. Prosecutors would need to dismantle your organization and prosecute everyone involved. She heard Samuel cursing as he examined the documents by the light of his flickering campfire. "How did you get these?" "I've been Katherine Hartwell, schoolteacher." "For 5 years, Samuel. But I've also been Rachel Morrison, investigator, collecting evidence about missing children and the adults who profit from selling them." Rachel's voice grew harder. "You created your own worst enemy when you taught a 12-year-old girl that some adults are monsters who need to be stopped." Samuel's associate tried to speak, but his voice was too weak to carry clearly. He was probably injured by the tunnel collapse and wouldn't survive long without medical attention. "Samuel, you have about 10 minutes to decide. Tell me about tomorrow's shipment or die here while I save those children without your help." "All right, Rachel, you win. The children are being held in an abandoned warehouse outside Kansas City. They'll be loaded onto a freight train tomorrow morning and shipped to buyers in Colorado Territory." "Which warehouse? What time? Who's guarding them?" Samuel provided the information Rachel needed, his voice growing weaker as dust and lack of fresh air began affecting his breathing. Rachel memorized every detail, then began preparing to leave. "Rachel, you have to get me out of here. I told you what you wanted to know. You told me about tomorrow's shipment, Samuel, but you've been selling children for 15 years. How? Many others have disappeared because of your operations?" Samuel didn't answer. "I thought so." "Samuel Morrison, you're exactly where you belong, buried under the weight of your own crimes." Rachel began crawling back through the ventilation shaft, leaving Samuel and his associate trapped in the collapsed tunnel. She had work to do in Kansas City, and 12 children's lives depended on her reaching them before Samuel's associates completed their shipment to Colorado Territory buyers. As she emerged from the mine into the cool mountain air, Rachel felt a grim satisfaction at finally confronting the man who'd shaped her life through his cruelty. Samuel Morrison was finished, but his criminal network would continue operating until every associate and buyer was exposed and prosecuted. Katherine Hartwell had been a successful school teacher who cared about children's education and welfare. But Rachel Morrison was something much more dangerous, a woman who'd spent years learning how to hunt people who hurt children and who had the skills and evidence needed to destroy them completely. The work was just beginning. Rachel rode through the night toward Kansas City, pushing her horse as hard as she dared while calculating how much time she had before Samuel's associates realized their leader was missing. She had perhaps 18 hours before the children were loaded onto trains and shipped to buyers throughout Colorado Territory. The abandoned warehouse Samuel had described was in the industrial district near the railway yards, a location that would allow quick transfer of human cargo without attracting attention from local authorities. Rachel had investigated similar operations during her years as Katherine Hartwell, and she understood how trafficking networks used legitimate businesses to conceal their crimes. But she also knew something that Samuel and his associates didn't expect. Over the past 5 years, she'd built her own network of allies and informants throughout the Western Territories. People who'd lost children to trafficking operations, law enforcement officials who weren't corrupt, journalists who were willing to investigate stories about missing children. Rachel wasn't planning to rescue 12 children single-handedly. She was planning to spring a trap that would destroy Samuel Morrison's entire criminal organization in one coordinated strike. She reached Kansas City as the sun was rising, tired but focused on the confrontation ahead. The warehouse district was already busy with legitimate commerce. Freight wagons loading and unloading, workers heading to jobs, the normal bustle of a growing industrial city. But Rachel knew how to spot the signs of criminal activity hiding behind legitimate business. She identified the warehouse Samuel had described by its excessive security, the nervous behavior of men guarding the entrances, and the way other workers avoided getting too close to the building. Rachel circled the warehouse district, noting escape routes and gathering points where she could position the allies she'd summoned by telegraph from Red Creek. By noon, she'd assembled a formidable force: federal marshals, territorial prosecutors, newspaper reporters, and parents whose children had been stolen by trafficking operations. The raid began at 2 o'clock, when the warehouse guards were expecting to load children onto freight cars for shipment to Colorado Territory. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by federal agents with arrest warrants and search authorizations. The 12 children Samuel had described were found chained in a storage room, along with shipping documents that revealed the identities of buyers throughout the Western Territories. Rachel's evidence from 5 years of investigation provided the context needed to understand how the trafficking operation functioned, but the most damning evidence came from Samuel Morrison himself. When federal agents reached the collapsed mine tunnel outside Red Creek, they found him alive but willing to confess to everything in exchange for medical treatment and protection from prosecution. Samuel's testimony exposed a criminal network that had operated for over 2 decades, selling hundreds of children to buyers who used them as slave labor in mines, factories, farms, and brothels. His confession led to arrests in 12 territories and the prosecution of corrupt officials who'd protected trafficking operations. The trials that followed became national news, exposing the scope of child trafficking in the American West and leading to federal legislation designed to protect children from commercial exploitation. Rachel's documentation was crucial to the prosecutions, establishing patterns of criminal behavior that allowed federal prosecutors to build cases against entire trafficking networks. But Rachel Morrison's most important victory wasn't legal or legislative, it was personal. She'd kept the promise she'd made to herself at age 12, the promise to destroy the man who'd murdered her mother and sold children into slavery. Samuel Morrison died in federal prison. 3 years later, his criminal empire dismantled, and his associates either imprisoned or fled to countries without extradition treaties. Katherine Hartwell returned to teaching after the trials, but her focus had changed. Instead of using education as cover for investigation, she devoted herself to creating schools that would protect children and provide them with opportunities that trafficking operations tried to steal. She established the Western Children's Protection Society, which investigated missing children and provided resources for communities trying to safeguard young people from criminal exploitation. The organization grew into a national network that pioneered modern child protection services. Rachel Morrison had begun her adult life as a victim seeking revenge against the man who destroyed her family. She entered it as an advocate who'd saved hundreds of children from the fate she'd narrowly escaped. The schoolhouse fire in Red Creek had been Samuel Morrison's final attempt to silence his stepdaughter. Instead, it had triggered his complete destruction and created lasting protections for the children he'd tried to exploit. Sometimes Rachel reflected in her later years, the most dangerous enemies were the ones who'd learned from childhood that some adults were monsters who needed to be stopped. Samuel Morrison had created his own nemesis when he'd taught a 12-year-old girl that protecting children was worth any risk. The lesson had served her well,